The year was 192 AD. Rome was the center of the known world, a city of marble temples, crowded forums, and endless whispers carried through the corridors of imperial power. At the very top of that power sat a man who believed he was not merely emperor, but something far greater. His name was Commodus. By the winter of that year, the Roman Empire had already begun to feel the quiet tremors of something deeply wrong within its leadership. Senators spoke carefully when his name was mentioned. Palace servants avoided eye contact, and soldiers stationed near the imperial residence had begun to notice unusual orders that made little sense. Because the Emperor of Rome was no longer behaving like an emperor. He was behaving like a gladiator. The transformation did not happen overnight. Commodus had not always been seen as dangerous. In fact, when he first took power in 180 AD, many believed Rome might be entering a new era of stability. He was the son of Marcus Aurelius, one of the most respected rulers in Roman history. Marcus Aurelius had been a philosopher king, a man who spent years leading campaigns along the northern frontiers while writing reflections on duty, discipline, and humility. Rome had grown used to rulers who carried the burden of responsibility with restraint. But Commodus had grown up inside the palace walls. Unlike his father, he never spent long years among soldiers or philosophers. His childhood had been surrounded by luxury, servants, entertainment, and constant reminders that one day he would rule the greatest empire on earth. Those who observed him closely during his youth recorded small details that later seemed far more significant. He enjoyed watching violent games in the arena far more than other members of the royal household. While senators preferred chariot races or theatrical performances, Commodus was fascinated by the raw spectacle of blood and combat. Servants described the way he leaned forward in his seat when gladiators fought. Not out of curiosity, out of excitement. Even as a young man, Commodus showed little interest in administration or military planning. Records from imperial advisors suggest that meetings meant to discuss provincial governance often ended quickly, because the young emperor simply lost patience. Instead, he spent long hours training with weapons. At first, this seemed harmless. Roman nobles often practiced combat as a form of exercise. But Commodus was not satisfied with practice. He wanted audiences. Within a few years of his rule, strange rumors began circulating throughout Rome. Some claimed the emperor had begun entering private arenas within the palace complex. Others claimed he was fighting trained gladiators during secret exhibitions, attended by selected members of the court. These were not official games organized for the public. They were something else entirely. Witnesses later described the atmosphere inside these private matches as deeply uncomfortable. Gladiators who entered the arena understood something immediately. They were not fighting as equals. The emperor always controlled the conditions. His opponents were sometimes wounded beforehand. Sometimes they were ordered not to strike back fully. In some cases, the weapons themselves were altered. The result was always the same. Commodus emerged victorious, and he expected applause. Those who watched carefully noticed something disturbing about these events. Commodus did not appear to see the arena as entertainment. He seemed to believe it proved something about who he was. By the mid-180s AD, the emperor had begun publicly comparing himself to Hercules, the legendary hero of Roman myth known for his immense strength and brutal labors. Statues began appearing across Rome depicting Commodus, dressed in the lion's skin associated with Hercules. Coins were minted showing the emperor holding a club and wearing the hero's attributes. This was unusual. Roman emperors often associated themselves with gods, but Commodus pushed the comparison further than most rulers ever had. He did not merely honor Hercules. He claimed to embody him. If you appreciate detailed investigations like this, you're watching the Ancestral Secrets. Subscribe and join us for more real case deep dives. What followed next would slowly convince many within Rome that something far darker was unfolding behind the imperial image. Because Commodus was no longer satisfied with private exhibitions. He wanted the entire empire to watch. The decision shocked nearly every member of Rome's political elite. The Emperor of Rome announced he would personally fight as a gladiator in the public arena. To understand why this was so disturbing, it is important to understand the social structure of Roman society. Gladiators were not heroes in the way modern audiences might imagine. Most gladiators were slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals. They existed at the very bottom of Roman social status. Their lives were owned by arena managers, and their survival depended on pleasing crowds who gathered to watch them bleed. For an emperor to step into that role was almost unthinkable. Yet Commodus did exactly that. Historical records from the historian Cassius Dio provide one of the most detailed descriptions of these events. According to his account, Commodus entered the Colosseum wearing elaborate armor designed to resemble Hercules. The crowd did not know how to react. On one hand, they were witnessing something unprecedented. On the other hand, everyone present understood the danger of showing disapproval. Because when the emperor fights in the arena, the rules change. The fights themselves were carefully staged. Commodus often faced opponents who had little chance of harming him. Some were ordered to use wooden weapons. Others were instructed to surrender quickly. Still, the spectacle was real enough for the crowd to feel the tension. And Commodus demanded payment for his performances. Each appearance in the arena was recorded as if he were a professional gladiator. The Roman treasury paid him enormous sums for every fight. In effect, the emperor was paying himself. The situation became even stranger during hunting displays known as venations. These were events where exotic animals were released into the arena to be killed for public entertainment. Commodus began participating in these hunts personally. According to surviving records, he killed dozens of animals during a single series of games. Lions, leopards, bears, and even elephants were brought into the arena for the emperor's demonstrations. But the methods he used were often designed to ensure the animals could not truly threaten him. Some were chained. Others were injured before the spectacle began. One account claims that during a particularly disturbing display, Commodus used a bow to shoot animals from a protected platform above the arena floor. He treated the event less like a hunt and more like target practice. The crowd applauded. They had no choice. But inside the Senate chambers, fear was beginning to grow. Because the emperor's behavior was becoming increasingly unpredictable. And in Rome, unpredictability from the man who controlled the army, the treasury, and the law could quickly become deadly. Whispers began circulating among Rome's most powerful families. Some wondered whether Commodus was simply eccentric. Others believed something much more dangerous was happening inside the imperial palace. The first real warning arrived in the form of a conspiracy. And it involved members of Commodus's own family. The plot was discovered before it could succeed, but the aftermath revealed a new side of the emperor that Rome had not yet fully seen. Punishment. Severe, personal, and relentless punishment. Several individuals connected to the conspiracy were executed. Others were exiled or stripped of their wealth. Commodus began to see enemies everywhere. Lists of suspected traitors circulated quietly through the palace administration. Names appeared without explanation. Then the executions began. Senators who had served Rome for decades were suddenly accused of disloyalty. Wealthy citizens lost their property overnight. Informants gained power by reporting whispers, rumors, or private conversations. Fear began spreading through the upper ranks of Roman society. Because under Commodus, accusation alone could become a death sentence. And as the years passed, the emperor's grip on reality seemed to grow even more unstable. The most disturbing developments were still to come. The city of Rome itself would soon become part of the emperor's personal fantasy. And the empire would be forced to watch. The unease inside Rome did not disappear after Commodus began appearing in the arena. If anything, it deepened. At first, many senators believed the emperor's fascination with gladiatorial combat was simply a phase, an embarrassing indulgence that would fade with time. Roman history had seen strange rulers before, and the empire had survived them. But Commodus did not move away from the arena. He moved deeper into it. By the late 180s AD, the emperor's appearances in public games had become more frequent and more elaborate. Each event was organized with almost theatrical precision. Announcements were sent across the city days in advance, preparing the population for yet another spectacle in which the ruler of the empire would step onto the sand like a professional fighter. The Colosseum, which had once been a symbol of Rome's power and engineering brilliance, slowly began transforming into a stage for the emperor's personal performances. And those performances were not cheap. According to records preserved by Cassius Dio and other historians, Commodus demanded enormous payments from the imperial treasury every time he entered the arena. Officially, the payments were recorded as wages for a gladiator. The amount was staggering. One appearance could cost the Roman state the equivalent of what entire military units were paid in a year. But no one in the administration could refuse, because the emperor himself had ordered the payments. The absurdity of the situation was obvious to anyone who understood Roman law. The emperor controlled the treasury, so when he demanded money for his own performance, the state simply transferred wealth from one imperial account to another. But the symbolism mattered. Commodus wanted to be seen not just as a ruler, but as the greatest gladiator in Rome. And he insisted that the empire recognize it formally. Those close to the palace later described how the emperor spent long hours training with professional fighters. These men were some of the most experienced gladiators in the empire, veterans of dozens of arena battles. Their job was to teach the emperor techniques that would make his performances appear impressive. Yet they faced a dangerous dilemma. If they trained him too gently, Commodus accused them of disrespect. If they demonstrated too much skill, they risked humiliating the emperor. Several trainers reportedly disappeared after private sessions inside the palace training grounds. Official explanations were rarely provided. At the same time, Commodus began expanding the scope of his arena activities beyond traditional gladiator matches. The hunting spectacles grew larger. Exotic animals were imported from distant regions of the empire, North Africa, Syria, and beyond. Entire shipments of wildlife arrived in Rome specifically for the emperor's events. The scale of the killing became almost impossible to ignore. One series of games reportedly involved the death of hundreds of animals over several days. Lions were brought in cages and released into the arena one at a time. Leopards were chained to posts. Ostriches ran across the sand while crowds watched from the towering stone seating above. Commodus entered dressed as Hercules. The image was carefully constructed. He wore a lion's skin draped over his shoulders, carried a heavy club, and sometimes used specialized arrows to strike animals from a distance. To the cheering crowd, it resembled a mythological hero conquering beasts. But those who watched closely noticed something unsettling about the emperor's behavior during these displays. He did not simply defeat the animals. He played with them. Cassius Dio recorded one moment that shocked many spectators. During a hunt involving ostriches, Commodus reportedly decapitated several birds with precise strikes. Then, holding the severed heads in his hands, he walked slowly along the edge of the arena facing the senators seated nearby. The gesture carried an unmistakable message, a reminder of what the emperor could do. The senators laughed nervously. They had to. But many understood the meaning behind the performance. The emperor was demonstrating power in the most direct way possible. Life and death were his to control. Inside the Senate, frustration and fear were growing. Rome's political elite had always expected emperors to display authority, but they also expected them to maintain dignity. The ruler of the empire was supposed to command armies, manage diplomacy, and ensure the stability of the state. Instead, their emperor was spending vast sums of public money staging violent spectacles for his own glory. And his interest in governing the empire seemed to be fading. Administrative responsibilities were increasingly delegated to palace officials and advisors, some of whom quickly realized how much influence they could gain by controlling access to the emperor. Corruption spread quietly through the imperial court. Positions within the government were bought and sold. Provincial governors paid enormous bribes to secure appointments. Legal decisions could be influenced by gifts delivered through intermediaries close to the palace. The emperor himself seemed largely uninterested in stopping any of it. As long as the games continued, and his image as Rome's living Hercules grew stronger, Commodus appeared satisfied. But the transformation of the emperor's identity was about to reach an even more disturbing stage. Because Commodus no longer wanted to simply imitate Hercules. He wanted the entire empire to acknowledge him as a god. Statues across Rome were altered or replaced to reflect the emperor's new self-image. Sculptors were instructed to depict him wearing the lion skin of Hercules, holding the club of the legendary hero. Temples began receiving orders to include Commodus among the divine figures worshipped by the population. Some inscriptions referred to him not merely as emperor, but as the reincarnation of Hercules himself. For many Romans, this crossed an invisible line. While emperors had often been deified after death, declaring oneself divine during life was widely considered excessive, even within the flexible religious traditions of Rome. Yet Commodus insisted on it. And the changes did not stop there. At some point during his rule, the emperor made a decision that stunned nearly everyone who heard it. He would rename the city of Rome. The capital of the Roman Empire, which had carried its name for centuries, would now be known by a different title. Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. It was a symbolic act that revealed how completely the emperor had begun reshaping reality around himself. Even the months of the Roman calendar were renamed in his honor. Each month received a new title connected to Commodus or his various claimed identities. Official documents were forced to adopt these new terms. To the outside world, the empire still appeared powerful. Legions remained stationed across vast territories. Trade continued through Mediterranean ports. Roman roads connected distant provinces as they had for generations. But inside the capital, the center of authority had become something unpredictable. Rome was no longer simply ruled by an emperor. Was ruled by a man who believed he was a living legend. And for the senators who had once governed the republic before the empire existed, the situation was becoming intolerable. Some began to quietly discuss the same question. How long could Rome survive under a ruler who seemed more interested in the arena than the empire itself? For the moment, no one dared to act, because Commodus still held absolute power. But behind the marble walls of the imperial palace, another conspiracy was already beginning to form. and this one would come far closer to the emperor than anyone expected. By the early months of 192 AD, the atmosphere inside the imperial palace had become tense in ways that were difficult to hide. Rome itself still functioned. Markets opened each morning. Senators attended formal sessions. The legions continued guarding distant borders. But the center of power had grown unstable. Commodus no longer behaved like a ruler managing an empire. Increasingly, he lived inside a world shaped entirely by his own imagination. Palace servants later described how entire sections of the imperial residence were redesigned to resemble training arenas. Gladiator equipment was stored alongside imperial regalia. Weapons that once belonged to professional fighters were kept near the emperor's private chambers. The line between emperor and entertainer had disappeared. More disturbing still was Commodus's plan for the coming year. According to multiple Roman historians, the emperor had begun preparing for an announcement scheduled for the start of the new year. The first day of January held deep symbolic meaning in Roman tradition. It marked the beginning of the political calendar and the installation of new officials. But Commodus intended to transform the occasion into something very different. He planned to appear in public dressed as a gladiator, not simply during games, as part of the official state ceremony itself. Even for a population that had grown accustomed to his strange behavior, this idea shocked the inner circle of advisors and administrators who still tried to maintain the appearance of imperial dignity. The Emperor of Rome would begin the new year by presenting himself not as a ruler, not as a consul, but as a gladiator champion of the arena. Inside the palace, several individuals quietly realized that if this plan moved forward, the authority of the Roman state might never recover. Among those who understood the danger were people who had daily access to the emperor himself. One of them was Marcia. Marcia had long been part of Commodus's inner household. Historical accounts describe her as a trusted companion who possessed unusual influence within the palace. Unlike many political figures who feared approaching the emperor directly, Marcia could speak with him privately. Another key figure was Letus, the commander of the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorians were the elite soldiers responsible for protecting the emperor, but their loyalty had often played decisive roles in Roman political struggles. Also involved was Eclectus, a senior chamberlain who managed access to the emperor's personal quarters. These individuals were not traditional rebels or ambitious generals seeking power. They were people who had spent years observing Commodus at close range. And by the final weeks of 192 AD, they believed the empire had reached a breaking point. The turning point appears to have come during a routine moment inside the palace. According to accounts recorded later, Commodus had prepared a list of individuals he intended to eliminate. Lists like this were not unusual during his reign. Suspected enemies often disappeared after being accused of disloyalty. But this particular list included names that shocked those who saw it. Marcia's name was reportedly among them. So were several other figures within the palace administration. Whether the emperor truly intended to carry out the executions immediately is difficult to determine. Roman sources often mixed fact with rumor, and historians still debate how accurate some details may be. But for the people who discovered the list, the message seemed clear enough. Their lives were now in danger. The decision that followed was quiet and deliberate. If Commodus remained alive, they believed the killings would continue. The emperor's behavior had grown too unpredictable, and too many powerful people had already been removed from the political landscape. So the conspirators began planning the only option they believed remained. The emperor would have to be removed. The timing was chosen carefully. The plot would take place on the night of December 31, 192 AD. While the city prepared to welcome the new year, events inside the palace would take a very different direction. The first step was subtle. According to surviving accounts, Marcia prepared a cup of wine mixed with poison. The drink was presented to the emperor during the evening as part of the normal routine of palace life. Commodus consumed it. For a short time, the conspirators believed the plan had worked. But the situation did not unfold as expected. Instead of dying quickly, the emperor became violently ill. He began vomiting, possibly expelling much of the poison before it could take full effect. The danger of the situation became immediately clear. If Commodus survived the night and realized what had happened, the consequences would be severe. The entire palace could be swept by executions. There was no longer time for hesitation. A second plan had to be carried out. Late that night, a professional wrestler named Narcissus was brought into the emperor's private chambers. Narcissus had trained with Commodus during earlier combat exercises and was known to be physically strong. His instructions were simple. Finish what the poison had started. Inside the imperial bath chamber, Narcissus confronted the emperor while he was weakened from illness. Ancient historians describe a struggle that ended with the wrestler strangling Commodus. The emperor of Rome died there, inside the palace where he had spent most of his life. He was 31 years old. The news of his death spread quickly through the city by the following morning. For many within the Senate, the reaction was immediate relief. Commodus's reign had lasted 12 years, but its final period had left Rome exhausted by fear and unpredictability. The Senate declared him a public enemy and attempted to erase his legacy through a practice known as damnatio memoriae. Statues were removed, inscriptions were altered, and official records were revised to distance the empire from his rule. But the damage left behind could not be erased so easily. Commodus had weakened the political balance that had held the empire together for generations. His death triggered a chain of events that historians now recognize as the beginning of one of the most unstable periods in Roman history. Within months, multiple claimants would fight for control of the empire. The year that followed would later be known as the Year of the Five Emperors. And when Roman historians looked back at the moment where the long stability of the Antonine dynasty finally collapsed, many of them pointed to the strange and violent reign of Commodus, a ruler who believed he was Hercules, a man who turned the greatest empire on earth into an arena for his own legend, and whose story revealed how dangerous absolute power could become when reality itself was no longer part of the emperor's world.